even though I do feel you're opportunist.
What do you think I'm getting out of it?
What you getting out of it? Cause let me tell you, ain't no river high enough, ain't no ocean deep enough, ain't no desert hot enough to keep me off your ass.
Nobody saw this coming, not the fans, not the blogs, and definitely not the people who thought this chapter of Kandi Burruss's life was finally settled. Because the moment Kandi's own mother allegedly broke her silence about Todd Tucker, the internet didn't just lean in, it held its breath. These weren't playful comments. These weren't subtle hints. These were words that landed like a warning that came too late. According to what's circulating, Mama Joyce didn't just speak, she unloaded. And the message people say she delivered was chillingly clear. Kandi was blind to things she should have seen. That single line sent shockwaves through the fandom, because if there's one thing viewers know, it's that Mama Joyce has never been quiet about how she feels, but this time, the tone was different. Less loud, more final. Like someone who believes the truth can't stay buried anymore. Fans immediately started replaying old episodes, old arguments, old moments that once felt like overreach or interference. Suddenly, those scenes didn't look so random. They looked intentional, calculated, protective in a way that now feels ominous. People began asking the question nobody wanted to ask before. What if Mama Joyce wasn't just being difficult? What if she thought she was warning her daughter? Social media erupted. Some accused her of trying to rewrite history. Others said this was the "I told you so" moment years in the making. And right in the middle of the chaos sat Kandi, once again caught between love, loyalty, and a narrative that refuses to stay quiet. Because if even a fraction of what's being implied is true, this isn't just family drama anymore. It's a story about missed red flags, loyalty tested too late, and a mother claiming she saw the cracks long before the world did. And once that door opens, there's no closing it back. The moment this story surfaced, it didn't feel like a fresh scandal. It felt like a reckoning that had been waiting years for its moment. Because when Kandi Burruss's mother is said to have spoken out again about Todd Tucker, fans didn't hear it as noise. They heard it as a callback, a reopening of wounds that never fully closed. And the phrase that stopped people cold, "Kandi was blind to it," landed not as an insult, but as a warning delivered far too late. For longtime viewers, this wasn't unfamiliar territory. Mama Joyce has always been vocal, protective, and fiercely involved in Kandi's life. But what made this moment different is how it's being framed. Not as emotional outbursts, not as jealousy, not as interference, but as hindsight, as someone looking back and insisting the signs were there all along, hidden in plain sight, dismissed because love clouded judgment. Almost instantly, fans began rewatching old episodes with a different lens. Arguments that once felt excessive now felt pointed. Moments when Mama Joyce questioned Todd's intentions, finances, or influence over Kandi stopped looking random. People noticed how often she pushed back when Kandi defended Todd, how often she framed her concerns as protection rather than control. And suddenly, viewers were asking the question they had avoided for years. What if she truly believed she was sounding an alarm? This doesn't mean fans suddenly accepted everything Mama Joyce has ever said. Far from it. Many still remember how harsh, confrontational, and relentless she could be. They remember moments that crossed boundaries and caused real pain. But this phase of the conversation wasn't about excusing behavior, it was about reinterpreting motive. Because motive changes everything when you're revisiting the past. According to online chatter, Mama Joyce's alleged comments weren't about accusing Todd of crimes or scandals. They were about patterns, about influence, about power dynamics. About Kandi being so focused on love and building a family that she may have overlooked things a more detached observer could see. And when a mother speaks in those terms, the message hits differently, not because it's automatically true, but because it comes from fear, not gossip. Fans immediately split into camps. One side felt vindicated, saying this was proof that Mama Joyce saw through Todd from the beginning. They argued that Kandi's success, generosity, and trust made her vulnerable, not stupid, but hopeful. And that sometimes the people closest to us see risks we don't want to acknowledge. To them, this wasn't an attack. It was a painful "I tried to tell you" moment. The other side wasn't buying it. They accused Mama Joyce of rewriting history to justify years of hostility. They pointed out that Kandi is a grown woman, a successful business mogul, and not someone easily manipulated. They argued that framing her as blind strips her of agency and ignores the fact that marriages are complex, evolving partnerships, not traps set by one person. And that critique resonated strongly with fans who have watched Kandi stand firm against family pressure before. What made this section of the story especially tense is how quiet Kandi has been. She hasn't rushed to confirm or deny what's being said. And that silence feels heavy, because Kandi has always been transparent when she feels wronged or misunderstood. Her lack of response left fans wondering whether she's protecting peace, avoiding escalation, or sitting with truths she's not ready to unpack publicly. Todd Tucker's position in all of this is equally complicated. Over the years, he's been portrayed as supportive, ambitious, and deeply involved in Kandi's empire. But he's also been criticized for benefiting from her success and clashing with her family. Mama Joyce's alleged comments reopened those old debates, not with new evidence, but with new framing. And framing can be just as powerful as facts when it reshapes memory. Another layer that made this moment explosive is timing. Why speak now? Why reintroduce this narrative at a moment when Kandi's life appears stable and successful? Fans speculated endlessly. Some suggested unresolved resentment. Others believed this was about legacy, about making sure her version of events exists before history settles on a different one. And some feared it was simply reopening pain that never needed to be touched again. What's undeniable is that this moment forced fans to confront an uncomfortable reality. Love doesn't erase red flags, it can postpone them. People began sharing their own stories in comment sections about ignoring warnings from family, only to understand them years later. That collective reflection gave Mama Joyce's alleged words more weight, even among those who didn't fully trust her delivery. Still, caution hovered over the conversation. Many reminded others that hindsight is seductive, that it's easy to connect dots after the fact, and that reinterpreting the past through present emotions can distort truth. That reminder mattered because this story sits at the intersection of family loyalty, personal choice, and public scrutiny, a place where certainty is rare. This first section of the story doesn't conclude that Mama Joyce was right or wrong. It reveals something more complicated, a family dynamic where protection and control may have blurred, where warnings and interference became indistinguishable, and where love made everyone vulnerable in different ways. As this chapter closed, fans weren't left with answers. They were left with questions that hit close to home. How do you know when concern becomes sabotage? When does loyalty become blindness? And how often do we dismiss warnings not because they're false, but because we're not ready to hear them? Because once someone says, "I saw it all along," the past stops being settled, and the story starts asking whether the signs were always there, or whether we only see them now because everything else has already happened. As the conversation moved into its second phase, the tone shifted from shock to dissection. People weren't just reacting to what Mama Joyce allegedly said, they were interrogating why her words were landing differently this time. Because for years, viewers dismissed her objections to Todd Tucker as meddling, jealousy, or control. But now, framed as hindsight instead of hostility, those same objections were being re-examined with uncomfortable seriousness. This phase was dominated by one idea: patterns only make sense once you're on the other side of them. Fans began lining up moments from across seasons, interviews, and off-camera commentary, not as proof, but as context. They remembered how often Mama Joyce questioned Todd's role in Kandi's businesses, how frequently she raised concerns about money, access, and influence, how she resisted blending finances and family in ways that felt extreme at the time. And suddenly, people were asking whether those concerns were less about dislike and more about fear. What intensified this reevaluation was how consistently Mama Joyce's criticism focused on structure, not personality. According to the chatter, she didn't frame Todd as evil or malicious. She framed him as someone whose presence shifted power dynamics in ways Kandi may not have fully accounted for while in love. That distinction mattered, because warning someone about imbalance is very different from attacking someone's character, even if the delivery is harsh. Fans who had once defended Todd without hesitation began acknowledging that relationships involving massive wealth and influence are rarely simple. Kandi is not just a wife. She's a brand, an employer, and a financial anchor for many people. Any partner entering that world doesn't just marry a person, they step into an ecosystem. And in ecosystems like that, blind spots can form, not because someone is naive, but because trust is assumed. This phase also reopened long-standing debates about agency versus protection. Critics of Mama Joyce argued that framing Kandi as blind infantilizes her, stripping her of autonomy and intelligence. Kandi built an empire. She navigated hostile industries. She negotiated power long before Todd entered the picture. To them, the idea that she could be so easily misled felt insulting, but supporters countered with a harder truth. Intelligence doesn't immunize anyone from emotional bias. Being successful doesn't prevent blind spots, it can actually deepen them. When someone is used to competence, they often assume competence in others. And when love is involved, skepticism can feel like betrayal. That doesn't make Kandi weak, it makes her human. What complicated this phase further was Todd's relatively restrained public presence. He hasn't aggressively defended himself against Mama Joyce's alleged framing. He hasn't launched counterattacks, and that restraint became part of the analysis. Some interpreted it as maturity, others saw it as strategic. But either way, the lack of noise shifted focus back to history, not reaction. Fans also began revisiting moments where Kandi appeared torn between her mother and her husband. Scenes where she defended Todd fiercely. Scenes where she looked exhausted by the constant tension. Scenes where she tried to broker peace that never fully arrived. In hindsight, those moments looked less like drama and more like the cost of standing between two competing forms of loyalty. Another layer that surfaced during this phase was resentment delayed. People began wondering whether Mama Joyce's words now are less about Todd himself and more about years of feeling dismissed. Years of watching her daughter choose love over warning. Years of being painted as the villain for refusing to fall in line. In that context, Kandi was blind to it, reads less like accusation and more like grief, the grief of being unheard. Still, many fans weren't ready to absolve Mama Joyce of past harm. They remembered how deeply her actions hurt Kandi, Todd, and others in the family. They argued that even if her concerns were valid, her methods caused damage that can't be rewritten as righteousness. And that perspective remains strong because intention doesn't erase impact. This phase also forced people to grapple with the danger of hindsight narratives. Once a relationship struggles or changes, it's tempting to retroactively assign meaning to every conflict that preceded it. Fans cautioned against turning every past argument into evidence. They reminded others that marriages evolve and that what looks like foresight later can simply be coincidence framed by outcome. Yet the discomfort wouldn't fully fade because the themes Mama Joyce allegedly raised are the ones people most often regret ignoring: money, control, influence, and access. Not flashy scandals, not betrayal headlines, but slow shifts in power that only become visible when it's too late to undo them. As this second chapter closed, the conversation became less polarized and more reflective. Fewer people were shouting about who was right. More people were asking what this story reveals about how families communicate concern, how love clouds perception, and how warnings often sound like attacks until hindsight reframes them. This phase didn't conclude that Mama Joyce was justified or wrong. It revealed something more uncomfortable, that multiple truths may exist at once. That a mother can be protective and damaging, that a husband can be supportive and still shift dynamics, and that a daughter can be strong, successful, and still miss signs she wasn't ready to see. And once that realization settles in, the story stops being about Todd versus Mama Joyce and starts being about the cost of navigating love, loyalty, and legacy in full public view, where every warning echoes louder long after the moment to act has passed. By the time this story reached its third phase, the heat had cooled, but the questions had deepened. What began as shock over Mama Joyce allegedly speaking out evolved into something far more introspective, a collective reckoning with how family warnings, love, and hindsight collide in ways no one fully understands while they're living through them. This phase wasn't about proving anyone right or wrong. It was about sitting with the discomfort that comes when the past refuses to stay settled. At this point, many fans stopped asking, "Was Mama Joyce right?" and started asking, "What does it mean if she thought she was?" Because belief, especially maternal belief, carries its own power. Even if her concerns were poorly expressed, even if her actions caused harm, the possibility that she genuinely feared for her daughter reframed the entire dynamic. Not as a battle for control, but as a clash between protection and autonomy that never found a healthy middle ground. This phase exposed the emotional cost of unresolved family tension. Kandi spent years standing between two worlds, the mother who raised her and the partner she chose. Viewers watched her absorb pressure from both sides, constantly negotiating peace that never quite arrived. In hindsight, that role looks exhausting. Not dramatic, exhausting. And fans began acknowledging that sometimes the damage in these situations isn't caused by one villain, but by the sustained strain of trying to keep everyone whole. What also became clearer is that time changes the meaning of words. When Mama Joyce criticized Todd years ago, it sounded like interference. Now, framed as hindsight, those same criticisms are being heard as warnings. That doesn't make them accurate, but it explains why they're resurfacing with new weight. Because when outcomes are complicated, people look backward for meaning. They search for signs that could have changed things if recognized sooner. Todd's role in this phase remained complicated and largely silent. His lack of public escalation didn't resolve questions, it preserved them. Some fans saw dignity in that silence, others saw calculation. But what mattered more than interpretation was the reality that silence allows multiple truths to coexist, even when they contradict each other. And that ambiguity kept the conversation from collapsing into simple blame. This phase also brought empathy back into focus, not just for Kandi, but for everyone involved. For a mother who may feel dismissed and unheard, for a husband who may feel perpetually scrutinized, for a daughter who had to choose love under a microscope while carrying the expectations of family, fans, and legacy. None of those roles are easy, and none of them come with clear instructions. Importantly, more voices began cautioning against rewriting history too cleanly. They reminded others that hindsight is seductive but unreliable, that it's easy to connect dots once you know where the story leads, that not every warning is prophetic, and not every ignored concern was a red flag. Relationships are lived forward, not backward, and judging past choices by present complexity can be unfair, especially to the person who had to make them without a map. Still, the conversation refused to disappear because the themes resonate far beyond celebrity culture. People recognize their own lives in this story. The warnings they ignored, the advice they dismissed, the family members they thought were interfering, only to later wonder if they were trying to protect them in the only way they knew how. That recognition gave Mama Joyce's alleged words power, even among those who don't fully trust her motives. What this phase ultimately revealed is that truth in family dynamics is rarely singular. A mother can be right about risk and wrong about approach. A partner can be loving and still create imbalance. A daughter can be brilliant and still miss things love makes hard to see. These truths don't cancel each other out, they overlap, creating tension that doesn't resolve neatly. As the story settled, fans weren't left with a verdict. They were left with reflection about how warnings sound different depending on who delivers them, about how love can feel like blindness in hindsight, even when it felt like clarity at the time, and about how public narratives flatten family pain into sides when real life rarely offers that simplicity. This chapter didn't end with confirmation or denial. It ended with a sobering understanding. Sometimes the most painful part of hindsight isn't realizing someone was right. It's realizing everyone was acting from fear, love, and imperfect information all at once. And once you see it that way, the story stops being about Mama Joyce versus Todd and starts being about how families fracture not because they don't care, but because caring doesn't always come with the wisdom to know how to show it without harm. Before you scroll, pause, because this is one of those moments where how you engage decides what kind of culture wins. This wasn't just reality TV chatter or family drama for entertainment. This was a real look at how love, loyalty, warnings, and hindsight collide, and how easily truth gets flattened when people rush to pick sides instead of listening. If this story made you rethink old episodes, old arguments, or even moments in your own life, don't ignore that feeling. Like this video to support conversations that go deeper than who's right and ask why things happen the way they do. Comment with your perspective, not to attack Mama Joyce, Todd, or Kandi, but to talk about family boundaries, red flags, and how warnings often sound wrong until it's too late. And subscribe because stories like this don't end when the clip stops. Context matters, patterns matter, and the next chapter always hits differently when you've been paying attention from the beginning. If anything else comes out, you'll want analysis that connects dots instead of creating villains. Scrolling past this means letting loud, shallow takes decide the narrative. Staying engaged means choosing nuance over noise and understanding over outrage. If you've ever ignored advice you later questioned, defended love against warnings, or been caught between family and your own heart, this story isn't just about celebrities. Stay here, join the conversation, and don't let complicated truths get drowned out by simple headlines.